Well, hey there, it's the Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from On Palestine, which is by Noam Chomsky, and we'll be doing the selected reading from Chapter 9, Nightmare in Gaza. So let's jump in. Amid all the horrors unfolding in the latest Israeli offensive in Gaza, Israel's goal is simple: quiet for quiet and a return to the norm. For the West Bank, the norm is that Israel continues its illegal construction of settlements and infrastructure so that it can integrate into Israel whatever might be of value. Meanwhile, consigning Palestinians to unlivable cantons and subjecting them to a repression and violence. For Gaza, the norm is a miserable existence under a cruel and destructive siege that Israel administers to permit bare survival, but nothing more. For the past 14 years, the norm is that Israel kills more than 2 Palestinian children a week. The latest Israeli rampage was set off by the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from a settler community in the occupied West Bank. A month before, 2 Palestinian boys were shot dead in the West Bank city of Ramallah. That elicited little attention, which is understandable since it is routine. The institutionalized disregard for Palestinian life in the West helps explain not only why Palestinians resort to violence, Middle East analyst Moin Rabbani reports, but also Israel's latest assault on the Gaza Strip. Quiet for quiet also enables Israel to carry forward its program of separating Gaza from the West Bank. That program has been pursued vigorously, always with U.S. support, ever since the U.S. and Israel accepted the Oslo Accords, which declare the 2 regions to be an inseparable territorial unit. And look at the map explains the rationale. Gaza provides Palestinians only access to the outside world, so once the 2 are separate, any autonomy that Israel might grant to Palestinians in the West Bank would leave them effectively imprisoned between hostile states, Israel and Jordan. The imprisonment will become even more severe as Israel continues its program of expelling Palestinians from the Jordan Valley and constructing Israeli settlements there. The norm in Gaza was described in detail by heroic Norwegian trauma surgeon Mads Gilbert, who worked in Gaza's main hospital through Israel's most grotesque crimes and returned for the current onslaught. In June 2014, he submitted a report on the Gaza health sector to the UNRWA, the UN agency that desperately tries on a shoestring to care for refugees. At least 57% of Gaza households are food insecure, and about 80% are now aid recipients. Gilbert reports, food insecurity and rising poverty means that most residents cannot meet their daily caloric requirements, while over 90% of the water in Gaza has been deemed unfit for human consumption. A situation that is becoming even worse as Israel again attacks water and sewage systems, leaving 1.2 million people with even more severe disruption of the barest necessity of life. In an interview, human rights lawyer Raji Saroni, who has remained in Gaza throughout the years of Israeli brutality and terror, said, "The most common sentence I heard when people begin to talk about the ceasefire is everybody says it's better for all of us to die and not go back to the situation we were used to before the war. We don't want that again. We have no dignity, no pride. We just are soft targets and we are very cheap. Either the situation really improves or it's just better to die." I am talking about intellectuals, academics, and ordinary people. Everybody is saying that. Similar sentiments have been widely heard. It is better to die with dignity than to be slowly strangled by the torturer. For Gaza, the plans of Norm were explained forthrightly by Doug Weisglass, the confidant of Ariel Sharon, who negotiated the withdrawal of Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005. Hailed as a grand gesture in Israel, among acolytes and deluded elsewhere, the withdrawal in reality was a carefully staged national trauma, properly ridiculed by informed Israeli commenters, among them Israel's leading sociologist, the late Bahru Kimrain. What actually happened is that Israeli hawks, led by Sharon, realized that it was a good sense to transfer the illegal settlers from their subsidized communities in devastated Gaza to subsidized settlements in the other occupied territories which Israel intends to keep. But instead of simply transferring them, as would have been simple enough, it was considered more effective to present the world through the images of little children pleading with soldiers not to destroy their homes amid the cries, "Never again," with the implicit and obvious. What made the farce more transparent was a replica of the staged trauma when Israel had to evacuate the Egyptian Sinai in 1982, but it played very well for the intended audience abroad. In Weisglass's own description of the transfer of settlers from Gaza to other occupied territories, what I effectively agreed to with the Americans is that the major settlement blocks in the West Bank would not be dealt with, but the rest would be dealt with until the Palestinians turned into Finns, but a special kind of Finns who would accept any rule by foreign power. The significance is the freezing of the political process. Weisglass continued, and when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent discussion about refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package is called a Palestinian state, with all that it entails has been removed from our agenda indefinitely, and all this time George W. Bush's authority and permission ratification both houses of Congress. Weisglass added that Gazans would remain on a diet, but not make them die of hunger, which would not help Israel's fading reputation. With their vaunted technical efficiency, Israeli experts determined how many calories a day Gazans needed to forbear survival, while depriving them of medicines, construction materials, or other means of a decent life. Israeli military forces confined them by land, sea, and air to what British Prime Minister David Cameron accurately described as a prison camp. Israeli withdrawal left Israel in total control of Gaza, hence the occupying power under international law. The official story is that after Israel graciously handed Gaza over to the Palestinians in hope that they would construct a flourishing state, they revealed their true nature by subjugating Israel to unremitting rocket attacks and forcibly captive populations to become martyrs, leaving Israel in a bad light for failing to anticipate this scenario. Reality is rather different. In January 2006, Palestinians committed a major crime. They voted the wrong way in a carefully monitored free election, handing control of the parliament to Hamas. The media constantly intoned that Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. In reality, Hamas leaders have repeatedly made it clear that Hamas would accept a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus that has been blocked by the United States and Israel for 40 years. In contrast, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestine apart from some occasional meaningless words and is implementing that commitment. True Israel accepted the roadmap for reaching two states initiated by George W. Bush and adopted by the courtlet that is to represent the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. But as he accepted the roadmap, Prime Minister Sharon at once added 14 reservations that effectively nullify it. The effects were known to activists, but revealed in the general public in the first time in Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. They remain under wraps in the media reporting and commentary. The 1999 platform of Israel's governing party, Likud, flatly rejects establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. And for those who like to obsess about the meaningless charters, the core component of Likud, Megan Begins Harut, has yet to abandon its founding doctrine that the territory of both sides of Jordan is part of the land of Israel. The crimes of the Palestinians in January 2006 was punished at once. The United States and Israel, with Europe shamefully trailing behind, imposed harsh sanctions on the Iraqi population, and Israel stepped up its violence. The United States and Israel quickly initiated plans for a military coup to overthrow the elected government. When Hamas had the authority to foil the plans, the Israeli assaults and the sieges became far more severe. There should be no need to review the dismal record since the relentless siege and savage attacks are punctuated by episodes of mowing the lawn, to borrow Israel's cheery expressions, for periodically shooting fish in a pond was part of what it calls war of defense. Once the lawn is mowed and the desperate population seeks to rebuild somehow from the devastation of the murders, there is a ceasefire agreement. The most recent ceasefire was established after Israel's October 2012 assault called Operation Pillar Defense. Though Israel maintained its siege, Hamas observed the siege as far as Israel concedes. Matters changed in April that year when Fatah and Hamas forged a unity through establishing a new government of the technocrats affiliated with either party. Israel was naturally furious. All the more was done, even the Obama administration joining the West in signing the approval. The unity agreement not only undercuts Israel's claim, but it cannot negotiate with a divided Palestine, but also threatens the long-term goal of dividing Gaza from the West Bank and pursuing its destructive policies in both regions. Something had to be done, and on occasion arose on June 12th, even with the Israeli boys murdered in the West Bank. Early on, the Netanyahu government know that they were dead but pretended otherwise, which provided the opportunity to launch a rampage in the West Bank targeting Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed to have certain knowledge that Hamas was responsible, but that too was a lie. One of Israel's leading authorities on Hamas, Shaloti Elder, reported almost once that the killers likely came from a dissident clan in Hebron that have a long-term side inside of Hamas. Elder added, "I'm sure they didn't get any green light from leadership of Hamas, they just thought it was the right time to act." The 18-day rampage after the kidnapping, however, succeeded in undermining the feared unity government and sharply increasing Israeli repression. According to Israeli military sources, Israeli soldiers arrested 419 Palestinians, including 335 affiliated with Hamas, and killed 6 Palestinians, also searching thousands of locations, and confiscated $350,000. Israel also conducted dozens of terror attacks in Gaza, killing 5 Hamas members on July 7th. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 19 months, providing Israel with a pretext for Operation Protective Edge on July 8th. By July 31st, around 1,400 Palestinians had been killed, mostly civilians, including hundreds of women and children, and 3 Israeli civilians. By then, large areas of Gaza had been turned into rubble. During briefing bombing pauses, relatives desperately sought shattered bodies or household items in the ruins of homes. 4 hospitals had been attacked, each yet another war crime. The main power plant was attacked, sharply curtailing the already limited electricity, and worse still, reducing the still further minimal availability of fresh water. Another war crime. Meanwhile, rescue teams and ambulances are repeatedly attacked. The atrocities throughout Gaza, while Israel claims that its goal is to destroy tunnels at the border, Israeli officials laud the humanity of what it calls the most moral army in the world, which informs residents that their homes will be bombed. The practice is sadism sanctimonially disguising itself as mercy, in the words of Israeli journalist Amira Haas. A recorded message demanding hundreds of thousands of people have already targeted homes for another place equally dangerous 10 kilometers away. In fact, there is no place in the collision with Gaza safe from Israeli sadism, which may even exceed the terrible crimes of Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009. The hideous revelations elicited the usual reaction from the most moral president in the world, Barack Obama. Great sympathize for the Israelis, bitter condemnation of Hamas, and calls for moderations on both sides. When the current episode of sadism is called off, Israel hopes to be free to pursue its criminal policies in the occupied territories without interference. The U.S. support has enjoyed in the past military, economic, and diplomatic, and also ideological, by framing the issues and conforming to Israeli doctrines. Gazans will be free to return to norm in their Israeli-run prison, while in the West Bank, Palestinians can watch in peace as Israel dismantles the remains of their possessions. That is likely the outcome if the United States maintains its decisive and virtually unilateral support for Israeli crimes and rejected of long-standing international consensus on diplomatic sentiment. But the future will be quite different if the United States withdraws its support. In that case, it would be possible to move toward the enduring solution in Gaza that the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called for, citing hysterical condemnation in Israel because the phrase could be attacked, and the horror of horrors, and the phrase might even be in violation of international law in the rest of the occupied territories. It is not that Israel's security would be threatened by the inherence of international law. It would likely be enhanced, but by explained 40 years ago by Israel General Ezra Weizman, later president, Israel could then exist on a scale spirit and quality should now embodies. There are similar cases in recent history. Indonesian generals swore they would never abandon what the Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans called the Indonesian province of East Timor, as he was making deals with the Timonese oil, and as long as they retained U.S. support through decades of virtually genocidal slaughter, their goals were realistic. In September 1999, under considerable domestic international pressure, President Clinton informed them quietly the game was over and that they instantly withdrew, while Evans turned to his new career as the lauded apostle of the responsibility to protect, to be sure, within provision to permit Western resort to violence at will. Another relevant case is South Africa. In 1958, South Africa's foreign minister informed the U.S. ambassador that although his country was becoming a pariah state, it would not matter as long as the U.S. support continued. His assessment proved fairly accurate. 30 years later, Reagan was the last significant holdout in supporting the apartheid regime. In a few years, Washington joined the world and the regime collapsed, not for other reason of course. One crucial, of course, was the remarkable human role in the liberation of Africa, generally ignored in the West, although not in Africa. 40 years ago, Israel made the fateful decision to choose expansion over security, rejecting a full peace treaty offered by Egypt in return to exacting the occupied Egyptian Sinai, where Israel was initiating extensive settlement and development projects. It has adhered to the policy ever since, making essentially the same judgment as South Africa did in 1958. In the case of Israel, the United States joined the world, and the impact will be far greater. Relations of power allow nothing else. It has been demonstrated over and over again when Washington has demanded Israel abandon cherished goals. Furthermore, Israel has now little recourse after having been adopted policies that turn it from a country greatly admired to one that is feared, despised, policies pursuing with blind determination today in its absolute march towards moral deterioration and possible ultimate destruction. Could U.S. policy change? It's not impossible. Public opinion has shifted more in recent years, particularly among the young, and cannot be completely ignored. For some years, there has been a good basis demands that Washington observes its own laws to cut off military aid to Israel. The U.S. law requires no security assistance be provided to any country in which the government consistent a pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Israel most certainly is guilty of this pattern and has been for many years. Senator Patrick Lee of Vermont, author of this provision of law, has brought it up to Israel in specific cases in well-conducted educational, organizational, activist efforts such as initiatives could be pursued successfully. It could have been a very significant impact himself while also providing a springboard for further actions to compel Washington to become part of the international community and to observe international laws and norms. Nothing can be more instrument for the tragic Palestinian victims of many years of violence and oppression. Okay, thank you.